In case you hadn't heard, America has a secret fleet of stealth Black Hawk helicopters. Last week, we talked about how the world found out about these exotic platforms and the technology that went into their design. This week, we're going to dive headlong into their combat history, starting with Operation Neptune Spear. Now, you may have already heard this story from the point of view of the SEALs on the ground, but we're going to place our focus instead on the complex air operation going on above and around them. But we won't stop there. We're also going to talk about the next batch of stealth helicopters built after the Bin Laden raid and what they've been up to since. So let's get started. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Okay, we've got a ton to go over this week, so let's dive right in. It's important to understand that during the lead up to the Bin Laden raid in 2011, intelligence officials couldn't guarantee that Bin Laden was actually inside the compound. Now that basically eliminated the possibility of using an airstrike via long-range cruise missile or even stealth aircraft, because there'd be no way to know that they actually got their man. And it was because of this that the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command decided that they needed to put boots on the ground. The question then became, how do you do that without their mode of transportation being detected by someone who could get a warning to Bin Laden? And that is where America's fleet of secret stealth Black Hawks first came into the picture. Now, despite Pakistan's help in the global war on terror, by 2011 it had become apparent that there were elements of its government and military institutions that were maintaining covert ties with various extremist and terrorist groups. And because there was no way to know which elements of these institutions you could and couldn't trust, being able to sneak past Pakistan's air defense radar arrays and surface-to-air missile systems became a priority. And unlike the pretty permissive airspace over Afghanistan, Pakistan at the time was operating a variety of largely Western-sourced air defense assets, like French-made mobile pulse Doppler radar arrays and a variety of surface-to-air missile systems, some newer than others. But as we discussed last week, being stealthy in a helicopter is about much more than mitigating radar detection. When it comes to low-flying and relatively slower helicopters, noise detection can be just as big a concern. And it was because of radar and noise detection concerns that America's stealth Black Hawk helicopters seemed to be just what the mission was calling for. Now, based on a variety of sources, one that's particularly worth mentioning is Sean Naylor's book, Relentless Strike: The Secret History of Joint Special Operations Command. At this stage in history, there were only two stealth Black Hawks in existence, and Operation Neptune Spear, the name for the mission to take out Bin Laden, would require using both of them. But there was a real problem. According to Naylor's sources, the SEALs' training for Operation Neptune Spear soon echoed the sentiments of Sikorsky's 1978 report that we discussed last week, namely that incorporating stealth elements into these helicopters had left them overweight, unstable, and difficult to fly. And one SEAL Team 6 member even said, quote, "The helicopter was very unstable when they tried to hover." Now, in the screenwriting game, we'd call that foreshadowing. Now, we know that these stealth Black Hawks were built sometime between 1998 and 2005, and that timeline adds up with the SEAL Team 6 members that Naylor interviewed, who said that leading up to the Bin Laden raid in 2011, these rotorcraft had actually been mothballed for a few years because of these stability concerns. Now, as the SEALs tell it, they argued pretty fervently not to use these stealth Black Hawks, and according to them, some of the aviators from the 160th SOAR tasked with flying these helicopters agreed. They contended that they could defeat radar detection just as effectively by terrain masking in their MH-47 Chinooks. And when I say terrain masking, I basically mean flying at very low altitude, hugging the terrain to avoid the radar being able to pick you up. Some of the SEALs allegedly recommended jumping into the compound, but that was reportedly shot down by JSOC's Admiral William McCraven, a Navy SEAL himself who contended that it was far too dangerous to parachute in because of the compound walls and power lines in the vicinity. Now, I want to be clear with you that in this next portion of the story, there are good sources that contradict each other, and as a result, you'll need to exercise some judgment in which elements you choose to believe. As we'll discuss, according to the SEALs that Naylor interviewed, the decision to use these stealth Blackhawks was broadly a political one made by Admiral McCraven. But, and there is always a but, according to aviators who actually participated in the operation, importantly, the chief warrant officer who planned it, those unproven stealth helicopters really may have given this mission its best possible chance at success. According to one of the SEAL sources, who believed it was McCraven's call to use these helicopters, his team was initially instructed to consider all options for the bin Laden raid. But then after the admiral presented the plan to President Barack Obama, political pressure of some sort made the use of these highly classified rotorcraft a requirement rather than an option. I'll quote him here. He sold it to the president that way. These things are invisible to radar. They'll get in. The Pakistanis will never know we were there. Now, as Naylor's sources put it, using these stealth Black Hawk helicopters became such a point of contention between SEAL Team 6 and the command element that Admiral McCraven allegedly even pushed for the firing of the team's command master chief, David Cooper, over his complaints about the aircraft. One of the SEALs said, and I quote, "The helicopters were really forced on us." Now, I want to take a second to address concerns about OPSEC, or operational security, because after all, at this point, we're effectively playing a game of telephone, discussing interpersonal conflicts within the most secretive confines of America's defense apparatus. And this is something that Sean Naylor addressed both in his book and in subsequent media interviews. Naylor has claimed on record that he was not provided any classified documents during his interviews, nor did he relay any overtly classified information in the book itself. Now, that may seem counterintuitive when discussing previously unreleased details about Operation Neptune Spear or any similar clandestine operation, but it's important to understand the nature of how information becomes classified in the first place. The US military has a formal classification process, which usually involves a fairly comprehensive assessment of any potential damage information could pose to American national security. That assessment is conducted by officials that we usually call Original Classification Authorities, or OCAs. Now, that's all to say that interpersonal conflicts between team members or their frustrations with the command element usually wouldn't fall within the confines of such a classification, but they could violate the individual source's non-disclosure agreements, which is probably why Naylor doesn't actually say the names of any of his sources. Now, if you find yourself wondering if we can trust Naylor's accounting of events, that really is up to you, but I want to be clear that his book, Relentless Strike, is pretty well regarded within both journalistic and academic circles, and as far as I know, there have been no special operators to come forward and say that he took their quotes out of context or misrepresented the situation. But, and there is always a but, it's important to remember that even if Naylor's reporting is exactly as credible as many, including myself, believe it to be, we're still talking about the accounts of Navy SEALs who conducted this raid, but not of the aviators who flew the mission. And as a result, these SEALs don't know what they don't know. They can only tell us what they heard happened in rooms that they weren't in. And that's why it's very important to look to other sources as well. Because while the accounts of these SEALs paint Admiral McCraven in a very negative and politically motivated light, other accounts from people who were actually in the room while these decisions were being made, including one from the senior chief warrant officer who actually planned the air operation, portray McCraven as a much more pragmatic leader who made the best decision he could with limited options. The truth is, there was good reason to want to use these stealth Black Hawk helicopters despite concerns about their stability. While the SEALs were almost certainly right that their brothers from the 160th SOAR could avoid radar detection in their MH-47 Chinooks, radar detection wasn't the only concern that military planners had for this operation. They were also very concerned with auditory detection, or the amount of noise produced by these helicopters. You see, this wasn't the first time elite special operators got a chance to take down bin Laden. In fact, one of the pilots assigned to Operation Neptune Spear, the Chinook pilot who responded when the stealth Black Hawk went down, had done this song and dance before. Back in 2006, American special operations teams received word that bin Laden was holed up in the Chagall Valley, northeast of Jalalabad, Afghanistan. I'm going to quote 160th SOAR Chinook pilot Chief Warrant Officer 5 Douglas Englen. Bin Laden was there. He was there, but it took us so long to get in. With the noise in the valley, he had an early warning network, and he was out of there. I'd say 2 or 3 minutes before we got in there, and that's just enough. Now, Englen was the air operation planner and flight lead for Operation Neptune Spear, and he has a very different take on Admiral McCraven. I'll quote him again. "We really wanted to do this mission and make sure that we are absolutely professional. That's what Admiral McCraven is, just the true professional, true leader." As far as Englen was concerned, being stealthy and quiet gave the operators on the ground their best chance at success and survival. In fact, that meant more to him than getting his own chance at special operations glory. I'll quote Englen again. "We went back and forth. I said a different airframe should be the first in there versus myself. To be completely unselfish, I'd rather pick the right tool for the ground force versus it always being myself." Now, Englen's take was later supported by the real experiences of the CIA's chief of staff at the time, Jeremy Bash. Years later, he would recount watching the 160th SOAR and SEAL Team 6 training for this operation, huddled in an observation post near the replica compound they were training on, and he was absolutely shocked at just how sneaky these helicopters could be. I'll quote him here. "To the surprise of everybody, the helicopters emerged not at the ridge we were looking at, but actually right behind us, right over our backs. It reinforced how these aircraft could come with a pretty good degree of surprise." Now, whether or not using these stealth Blackhawks was ultimately a political or tactical decision, it remained clear that the stability of these helicopters was an issue. And that's something that all of the sources can agree on, as they trained for a variety of contingencies that could surface during this operation. One of the most heavily rehearsed was what to do in the event of a crash. As one SEAL said, "We did so many downed helo drills that the operators were just sick of it." And while the SEALs trained relentlessly to be able to complete their mission even if one of these stealth Blackhawks went down, Englen and the other Chinook pilots did the same, training to respond in the event one of these exotic helicopters were to crash. And that was vital, because one of the biggest concerns planners had was the possibility that Pakistan's military would respond to this incursion in a very aggressive manner, descending upon the compound with a numerically superior force that would leave the SEALs fighting for their lives against a nation that was supposed to be a partner. Now, according to some sources, there were initial discussions that if such a contingency were to arise, the team should fortify their positions inside the compound and wait for a diplomatic solution. But the SEALs in Naylor's book knew the reality of warfare, and what that really meant was that no one would be coming to get them. If a firefight was already underway, there was little chance that high-level diplomatic talks would get the local military assets responding to the incursion to break off contact. It could take hours for them to even get word that these talks were taking place, and by then every member of the team could be dead. I'll quote one of the SEALs again. "Thankfully, the president said, no, they're not going to surrender. They'll fight their way out, and we'll go in and get them if we have to." The guys were thankful for that. They wouldn't have surrendered anyway. Now, the plan already called for Chinooks to be positioned nearby to refuel the stealth Blackhawks after the raid, but in order to mitigate concerns associated with a crash, they also made provisions for a quick reaction force to be stationed with those Chinooks. They also planned to have tactical aircraft patrolling near the border, ready to make a quick dash into Pakistan to provide close air support if necessary. And according to some sources, they actually started flying these patrols in the region weeks ahead of time to normalize the presence of these aircraft so as not to alert Pakistan's defenses by their presence the night of the raid. But even all this planning didn't assuage all the concerns from SEAL Team 6. I'm going to quote Senior Chief Petty Officer Rob O'Neill, who was a former member of the team that conducted the raid. We were pretty sure that we weren't going to come back from the mission. We had this new stealth technology, but no one really knew if it worked. We didn't know how good the air defenses for Pakistan were. We knew that we were invading, and that they could shoot us down and be justified. 1 hour before midnight on May 1st, 2011, 2 stealth Blackhawks departed Jalalabad, with 3 additional Chinooks following closely behind. The Chinooks set down north of Abbottabad, standing by with both the quick reaction force and the fuel and equipment necessary to refuel the Blackhawks as they departed Pakistan once the job was done. As the stealth Blackhawks closed with the compound, they found the neighborhood below surprisingly enveloped in darkness. Some have since claimed this blackout was the result of covert shaping operations that have still yet to be disclosed or acknowledged, while others claim that rolling blackouts may have been a somewhat common occurrence in this region at the time. All of the operators and crew members aboard the stealth Blackhawks and the Chinooks were flying sterile. That's a term used to describe being stripped of any identifying materials like name tags, unit patches, family photos, and even wedding rings. Anything that could connect them to a life outside of the fight. As Englen recalls, the only personal objects he had with him other than his M9 pistol and M4 rifle was a little bit of cash and a few cigars for bargaining with captors. The stealth Blackhawks flew in complete blackout conditions and were exceedingly quiet, but they weren't invisible. According to intelligence reports, someone did try to call one of the 2 brothers who lived with bin Laden in the compound, but that call went unanswered. Now, according to those intel reports, calls this late at night were exceedingly uncommon, and it's entirely possible that they were trying to get a warning to the terrorist leader. But because the call wasn't answered, we'll never know for sure. But what we do know for sure is that the technological efforts to silence these helicopters were apparently highly successful. Neighbors of the bin Laden compound would later report not hearing these helicopters at all during their approach and only suddenly making out the rotor noise once they were directly overhead. The 2 stealth Blackhawks parted ways, with one landing outside the compound to deploy a K9 unit, interpreters, and operators to defend the perimeter. The other hovered directly over the compound to allow the operators inside to fast rope down inside the walls. And that's when everything went sideways. The training compound that they had used to prepare for this operation was designed to give the teams an accurate sense of scale and direction, but didn't use the same materials in its construction. The high exterior walls of the compound had been approximated using chain link fence, which allowed the downdraft from the helicopter's rotor to circulate unabated. The brick walls of the real compound, however, did not. And to make matters even worse, the stealth Blackhawk was carrying more fuel and equipment on board than they had initially planned for, which also threw off the pilot's mental calculations. As the top secret stealth helicopter hovered above the compound, the rotor downwash, or airflow being forced down by the spinning rotor blades, couldn't sufficiently diffuse due to the combination of high walls and unexpectedly warm temperatures that night. This created an extremely dangerous condition known as a vortex ring state, rapidly reducing the amount of lift produced by the spinning rotor. For a helicopter that already had vertical stability issues, this could have been a death sentence for everyone on board. I'll quote one of the SEALs. That air bled through the chain link fence, but in reality, the compound had those solid walls, and that bad air just came right back up into the rotor blades, and that thing just lost power. As the loss of control set in, the helicopter's tail grazed the compound wall, and the Blackhawk began to roll. Acting quickly, its pilot buried the nose into the ground. It touched down at a 45-degree angle with its nose in the dirt and its tail stuck high atop the wall. According to Admiral McCraven, this unnamed pilot of the stealth Blackhawk had assured him that no matter what, he'd get the job done. I'll quote that pilot according to McCraven. "Look, sir, unless I'm dead, I'll be able to get this helicopter on the ground safely, over into this thing we call the animal pen, on the other side of the wall." And he kept that promise. According to one of the SEALs on board, he handled the crash so proficiently that they barely even noticed the impact. All the training for crash contingencies immediately paid off as the SEALs poured out of the downed helicopter into what had become familiar territory for them. Not only had they trained for this specific raid for months, but they all had hundreds of similar compound assaults under their belts. These operators may have just lost their ride out, but ultimately, these guys are warfighters from the American Joint Special Operations Command. They were in their element, doing what they did best, taking initiative on the ground. Back in Washington, D.C., former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon was among those listening in. As he later recalled, the team handled the crash so expertly that, quote, you wouldn't have even detected an increase in heart rate. North of Abbottabad, the QRF team was hurriedly setting up the refuel point when the call came over the radio. I'll quote Chief Warrant Officer Englen. We just went into contingency mode. Didn't know the severity. If it was crashed with casualties, if it crashed in a civilian area, all we do is minimize our time and get there as quick as possible. Within seconds, Chief Warrant Officer Englen and his crew in Chinook 1 were airborne, and they reached the compound just 10 minutes after the call came in. In the moments to come, the SEALs would face repeated setbacks as they cleared the compound and ultimately took out the most prolific terrorist in modern history. But that's why the mission fell to them. SEAL Team 6 isn't just another SEAL team. They're hand-selected from across the SEALs for their proficiency and expertise. An elite team plucked from elite teams specifically for their ability to adapt, overcome, and accomplish the mission. As the SEALs did what they do, the pilots of the stricken helicopter assessed the damage. At least one of them believed that they might be able to get the stealth Black Hawk back into the air if left empty, which would allow them to limp this highly classified rotorcraft back into friendly territory. But that suggestion was ultimately dismissed, and the SEALs packed the helicopter with enough explosives to hopefully make sure that no one could recover its exotic technologies. But there was a problem. The tail was still resting high atop the wall, and none of the SEALs could reach it, so they packed the helicopter with enough explosives to hopefully engulf it in a shrapnel-filled fireball. I'll quote Chief Warrant Officer Englen again. I was probably 100 feet from the aircraft when they blew it up. It pushed our aircraft to the side. I actually had to fly away, make a tight circle, and come back in and land under the mushroom cloud. I landed to the east of the compound right next to it. I mean, like right next to it. But when the smoke cleared, the tail of the helicopter remained intact, falling outside the compound walls. Now, although this tale would soon become headline news around the world, no one was blamed for this. After all, these were very difficult circumstances. Just 38 minutes after the first SEALs' boots hit the ground, they were on their way back to Afghanistan. But the danger wasn't over yet. The Chinook was carrying an 800-gallon fuel tank on board and was packed to the brim with operators, intelligence materials, and one dead terrorist mastermind. They were at the aircraft's maximum allowable weight, and without stealth to protect them from detection, the danger of being shot down was more present than ever. As they closed with the border, Pakistani F-16s scrambled to intercept. Englen won't offer details as to how they evaded being shot down, but explained that it was an electronics fight. Now, it's worth noting that news outlets have reported that these Chinooks received new electronic warfare equipment just prior to this operation, and that Chief Warrant Officer Englen had indeed helped certify these systems and their crews in their use. Englen would also later credit the U.S. Marine Corps' Weapon and Tactics Instructor course, which trained him extensively in air-to-air combat between helicopters and fighter jets. After all, he was trying to evade an American-made F-16. Englen was eventually able to shake the F-16s and make it out of Pakistan, and Operation Neptune Spear was announced to the world later that night. According to media sources, Pakistan's intelligence service would ultimately sell access to the leftover tail section directly to China to grant them insight into its radar-absorbent skin. But the rest of the debris was ultimately returned to the United States in the weeks ahead. Now, Operation Neptune Spear was the end of the story for Osama bin Laden, but not for America's stealth Black Hawk program. Despite losing one of just 2 stealth Black Hawks in existence, this operation had proven just how valuable these stealthy and supremely quiet rotorcraft could be if they could just work out all the problems. And it's not as though they didn't have the budget to do it. In 2013 alone, the United States dedicated at least $52.6 billion to covert operations and research. When adjusted for today's inflation, that equates to just shy of $70 billion today, which falls just short of Russia's entire military expenditure in 2022. In other words, the stealth Black Hawk concept may have had some technical challenges, but America's covert coffers offered plenty of funding to get them resolved. And based on reports, that's exactly what they did. By 2014, an unknown number of updated stealth Black Hawks were reportedly constructed and delivered to the famed 160th SOAR, with a now permanent detachment of 40 specially trained personnel to operate and maintain them. Now, details about these improved stealth Black Hawks remain nebulous, tucked away behind classified lines of accounting and paperwork mountains made up of standard Form 312 classified information non-disclosure agreements. But every so often, these helicopters break cover, and rumors swirl about their use. One of the most credible came on July 3rd of 2014, when two stealth Black Hawks carrying Delta operators entered Syria via the Jordanian border. Unfortunately, however, while the stealth Black Hawks worked perfectly this time, the hostages weren't there when Delta Force arrived. In the days that followed, the only real evidence that Delta had ever even been there came from Syrian eyewitnesses who recounted the eerie sight of soldiers riding in silent helicopters. Now, believe it or not, there's still so much more to this story that I didn't cover in these videos, and if you're really interested in the topic, I highly recommend that you read our series on Sandboxx News, where I have the room to provide some added context and detail. But until then, so ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the Force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.